Dear audience, welcome to the show POWERchat. In today's episode, we'll be discussing on international humanitarian laws and the status of missing people in Nepal. Joining us today is Mr. Andre Paquet, Mission Head, International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC-Nepal. Please allow me to welcome him. Welcome to the show, Mr. Paquet.
Thank you for inviting me.
How have you been?
Very good, thank you.
Well, it's been more than a year you joined Nepal as the head of the mission of ICRC. And you were also here a decade ago as the deputy head of the mission of ICRC.
Indeed.
Well, what are your impressions over post-conflict Nepal?
Well, first of all, the ICRC consider Nepal still as a post-conflict situation. Yeah. So in that respect, this is the reason for us to be here in order to tackle humanitarian issues related to the past conflict. Yeah. And as we can see, since the end of the conflict, the government is focusing on elaborating a new constitution. So we have a chance now to see a conclusion of this with the implementation of the constitution through the three-level elections. So we hope this will go through smoothly. Yeah. And then following this should give some space for the government to have other priorities. And we invite the government to consider transitional justice as a priority following the implementation of the new constitution.
Do you think that the transitional justice system processes are in right track on addressing issues concerning the victims' families, the victims of the 10 years long conflict?
Well, what we can see so far is that the transitional justice is not a priority as such. It's a little bit on the back burner. This is possibly because the first priority is to confirm the new constitution, which is fine, yeah. But now by putting a priority on the transitional justice would need to put some interest to look at the possibility of reinforcing the act of the commissions and to decide for how long the commissions could be needed. Yeah. So and to adapt the national legislations according to the responsibilities, to fit the responsibilities of the commissions.
How do you observe the implementation status of the international humanitarian laws that Nepal had made commitments to international community?
Yeah. There is in Nepal a relatively good basis for international humanitarian law and international treaties and conventions to be adopted and ratified, in the sense that there is an IHL committee composed of high-level civil servants from different ministries that are meeting regularly to look at the different treaties or conventions that could be looked at and signed and ratified by Nepal. So it means that there is an expertise developed in the country that is available to the government, that is available to the parliamentarians. Yeah. So recently we have updated a book on IHL for the parliamentarians, for them to understand the basics of IHL and to see this as from the eye of a parliamentarian. Yeah. And from our side, we have a good contact with this IHL committee, and we stand always ready to support them, whatever question they may have concerning IHL.
There are different instruments, especially that of the human rights one, that Nepal has shown its commitments through ratification and sometimes by signature. What is your assessment? Do you think that Nepal stands for its commitment to international human rights treaties and instruments?
Well, in the first place, if we look at the international humanitarian law, which is actually the law of war, the government of Nepal has signed, ratified the Geneva Conventions, the 4 Geneva Conventions, which correspond to the basic of IHL. It has also ratified different other treaties and conventions, but has not yet ratified the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which are made to reinforce the respect for the civilians, people not taking part in conflict. So we invite the government to consider these additional protocols and other conventions. And in addition to that, whenever a country ratify conventions, international conventions or treaty, it has to make national law from the national legislation to make a link between the newly adopted international treaty with the national legislation. And sometimes this is what is lacking or takes time. So concerning Nepal, with the Geneva Conventions, there is Geneva Convention bill, which is pending and is looked at by the government at the moment.
How would ratification to additional protocol, you were mentioning that of the Geneva Convention, make difference on addressing the cases of the 10 years long conflict, especially addressing the concerns of the victims' family there in Nepal?
Well, in the first place, so if Nepal ratify the additional protocols, then it will give the government additional tools so to face whatever situation the country may encounter in the future. So well, we may say, okay, well, we're just out of a conflict in Nepal, so why shall we look into laws and protocols, concerning conflict? Well, we never know what could happen. So then, in terms of prevention, in times of peace, is the best time to look into these issues. Right? And by ratifying the additional protocols, yes, this will give the country additional substance, material, to implement the transitional justice process.
Well, Mr. Paquet, before I go with the questions on missing persons in Nepal, I would like to ask you on the ICRC's work priorities in Nepal. Could you tell us the priorities of ICRC here in Nepal?
We are already more than a decade after the end of the conflict in Nepal. So the ICRC, which is a humanitarian organization geared to do humanitarian work during and after conflict situations. So then we have adapted and reduced our presence or footprint in the country. Nevertheless, we remain committed to the country, and our identity now is related to the transitional justice. It means that we care for the conflict victims. In the first place, the missing persons, because for the missing person, the Geneva Conventions continue to apply in Nepal, even more than 10 years after the conflict, due to the common Article 3 to the Geneva Convention. So consequently, we stand ready to discuss with the government, with the commissions, TRC and CEIDP, the law, the international law, in order to have a good understanding of the international standards. Then we stand ready to discuss the situation for the conflict victims. As far as we are concerned, especially again the missing persons and the families of the missing, because we have been following the victims for nearly 2 decades now, during the conflict and after the conflict. So we have a good understanding of the needs of the conflict victims. So we stand ready to discuss this with the government, the Commission. And finally, we also stand ready to reinforce the guidelines and the procedures in order to implement the work, necessary work for to complete the transitional justice process.
How do you work with the government institutions and civil society organizations here in Nepal?
Well, we, as I said, we've been close to the victims. We have been working with the victims. At this stage, we do not have any particular program ongoing with the victims. So the last one was ended last September. It was a program in favor of the families of the missing. But we continue having a good understanding of the situation. We are in contact with the families of the missing through our partnership with the Nepal Red Cross Society, the NRCS. Yeah. And we have developed some close relation with the Conflict Victim Association. NIFA, the CVCP, and others. So we've been working with them. We have tried to facilitate their work. Sometimes they need to gather, they need to also understand what are the international standards, and we're trying to reinforce their capacity for them to be able to tackle the issues with the government. Yeah.
Well, following the 10 years long armed conflict in Nepal, many people went missing, and still there is data that about 1,400 people are missing.
Yes.
What should be done to make the status of missing people public and to punish the perpetrators?
Well, in the first place, what we are advocating for is a humanitarian mechanism. It means that we invite the government to do whatever possible to recognize the victims as conflict victims in the first place, and to seek the necessary measures and programs in order for the victims to be compensated for the lost. Yeah. So then we have to see also what are the needs and the requests of the families themselves as well.
The International Day of the Disappeared was observed last week here in Nepal, and the members of the victims' families were criticizing the work of an instrument called Commission of Investigation on Enforced Disappeared Persons, CEIDP, for not working at all. How do you observe the work of CEIDP? Are you satisfied with its role, its mandate?
As we mentioned earlier, there is a question on the act of the Commission. Some believe that it is not in line with the international standards, so the act or the capacity of the commissions in the first place. What is also noted is that the national legislation does not fit the responsibilities or does not allow the commissions to implement its work. So there is a need to look into those two things: the act of the commissions, both commissions, and the national legislation. So I believe that there are actors of the international community that are advocating for the acts to be amended and the national legislation. In addition to that, I believe that the court, Supreme Court of Nepal, also came out with some recommendation to the government in order to do the same, to work on the act for a stronger act and to adapt the national legislation. So the conflict victims, when they look at the Commission, they look at the transitional justice, they see that this is pending. So some decision should be taken in that respect, to see, to develop a real will of going through the transitional justice. And in addition, the victims themselves lack information. They are not informed about the work which has been done by the Commission, and involving them would be beneficial. Yeah. So the first place, the victims would be aware of what is going on. They may then start to believe a little bit more on the transitional justice, and they could be quite useful to the Commission as well.
Is it due to Nepal has not ratified or is not a signatory to International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances?
This is one aspect that is lacking on the national legislation. There is no provision for enforced disappearance. So then Nepal has to look into that. In addition, so yes, well, Nepal could consider signing the convention on enforced disappearance, because this would give them some tools, different laws that are already put together in order to reinforce the capacity of a government, of its law enforcement, to act on enforced disappearance and to take measure if ever this is happening. Yeah. Then by signing it, then they would still have to link it to the national legislation. So, yeah.
What should be the national priority, since it's already late that victims' families have been demanding with the authorities, especially those of the transitional justice instruments, including CEIDP, to make the status of their beloved one public?
Yeah. Yes. Well, it is painful for the families to be waiting years and years. At the same time, we have to understand that following a conflict, nothing is easy. It takes time. So Nepalis should be patient. They should be resilient, but they should be also demanding. Yeah. So, but it is normal that it takes time. Yeah. That's why we shall see a transitional justice on a longer period, because, well, of course, there will be plenty of work to be done when reaching the end of the commissions, I believe in February 2018. This is very soon. Yeah. So there should be a mechanism put in place so that the transitional justice could go on as long as it needs in order to find some conclusion.
What is the role of judiciary or the permanent type of justice systems like National Human Rights Commission on addressing these issues? National Human Rights Commission and other human rights actors and the Conflict Victim Association have an important role to play, because they are from the civil society. They represent the civil society, they represent the conflict victim, they are close to them, they are part of them most of the time. So it would be useful for the government to work closely with them. Well, how do you measure the impact of ICRC's humanitarian work in Nepal? I hope it's good. So in the first place, I think the biggest impact of the ICRC
in Nepal is out of the conflict time. So at the time, the ICRC had the chance to be accepted by the parties in conflict and had the possibility to reach the communities, including communities in remote areas that were affected by the situation, and to do something for them. Because during such situation, it is clear that it is difficult for a government to continue caring for the basic needs of its population. And here we're talking about having access to healthcare, having access to water. Water systems need to be maintained. Healthcare centers need to be supported. So during a conflict, those things that normally works very well out of a conflict then becomes a burden. So then the ICRC had a great impact for the communities affected by the situation by reinforcing, supporting the health centers, by doing whatever necessary when there was a need to work on the water system. In addition to that, the ICRC was in contact with the parties in conflict. So in order to have some respect for the civilians, have some respect during the conduct of hostilities. Yeah? There was a dialogue with the parties. And finally, the ICRC was also able to visit the prisoners from both sides. Yeah, to ensure that they were well treated and they had everything they need to during the detention. So the ICRC has done that during the conflict, and I believe this has created an important impact. I think it is recognized today. We do have some credit for this work, and then following the conflict, we continued doing the same work for a few years, until the government was able to take back its responsibility, and then we have then reduced our presence in the country.
Well, what should be done to comply Nepal with its international commitments on international humanitarian laws in particular?
As we mentioned just before, I believe it is important to design a closure to the conflict that happened in Nepal through the transitional justice. So we are not here to decide for the government what it should be, but whatever the government decides to do as a conclusion to its conflict, then we will be here to support it. To support the government in terms of knowing the law, in terms of connecting with the victims, in terms of working on guidelines and procedures that they may need. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Paquet, we are coming to the end of the show. Do you have anything to share to our audience that I have left to ask you, very briefly?
Since we've been talking about transitional justice, I would like to remind that it takes time, and it is normal. By experience, we saw that in many contexts following conflict. So we invite the Nepali to be patient, to be resilient, but to be demanding also.
Well, Mr. Paquet, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.